On the 20th of July 1969, a voice drifted across the void of space and into the living rooms of more than 600 million people. For a moment, the whole world seemed to exhale. People cheered, some even cried. A decade-long national obsession had finally reached its peak. Humanity, or so it seemed, had finally conquered the moon. But not everyone bought the story. Even as the celebrations erupted in New York, as Nixon made his congratulatory phone call, as Armstrong and Aldrin pressed their boots into that grey, powdery surface 384,000 kilometers from home, a different question was already forming in the background. What if the greatest leap in human history never left the ground at all? In 1976, a former US Navy officer and writer named Bill Kaysing self-published a 35-page pamphlet. The title was blunt, almost clinical. We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle. Kaysing had worked as a technical writer for Rocketdyne, the company that built the Saturn V rocket engines. He was not an engineer. He was not a scientist, but he had clearance, and he had eyes. And what he believed he saw, or rather didn't see, convinced him that the entire Apollo program was the greatest deception ever staged.
32 seconds into the flight, the 3 liquid fuel main engines soon will throttle back to 72% of rating.
His argument, stripped to its bones, was simple. The technology wasn't good enough. The United States couldn't actually land men on the moon in 1969, but they desperately needed to beat the Soviets, so they faked it. The theory was whispered about for years, a few magazine articles, late-night radio shows. Then, in 1978 and later in 1980, Hollywood handed the conspiracy theorists a gift they could barely have dreamed of. A film called Capricorn 1 hit cinemas, a dark thriller about the first manned mission to Mars. In the story, everything looks perfect, until moments before launch. NASA quietly pulls the astronauts out of the capsule. The mission, or so they're told, is doomed. The life support systems won't work, and if they go up, they die. But cancelling the mission, that would be even worse. So the astronauts are flown to a remote desert hangar, a giant empty soundstage, and ordered to fake the entire mission on camera. The launch goes ahead without them. The world watches in awe, and behind the scenes, a government machine begins doing whatever it takes to keep the lie alive. It was fiction, but to conspiracy theorists, it felt like a confession. Then there was Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, a slow-burn horror film about a writer going mad in an isolated hotel. On the surface, nothing to do with the moon, but one scene in which a young boy wears a jumper knitted with an Apollo 11 rocket was seized upon. Some claimed it was Kubrick's coded confession, that he had directed the fake moon landing footage at Langley or some secret studio, that the clues were hidden in plain sight for those with eyes to see. The conspiracy theory had done something terrifying. It hadn't faded away. It hadn't been debunked into obscurity. It had spread. It had evolved. It had become cultural. And now, it had teeth. Over the following decades, the moon landing hoax theory evolved. For example, take the footage of Buzz Aldrin planting the American flag on the lunar surface. The flag appears to ripple and wave. There's no atmosphere on the moon. There's no wind. Therefore, the theorists argue the footage must have been filmed on Earth in a studio where air currents moved the fabric. Then there is the Van Allen radiation belts, two donut-shaped zones of intense radiation surrounding Earth, held in place by the planet's magnetic field. The outer belt alone contains enough high-energy particles to deliver lethal radiation doses to unprotected humans in minutes. Theorists argue that no spacecraft in 1969 could have shielded the astronauts adequately, and that NASA has never been able to satisfactorily explain how 3 men survived the passage. You can also look at any photograph taken on the lunar surface during the Apollo missions. The sky is pitch black. Not a single star is visible. The moon has no atmosphere, nothing to scatter or dilute starlight. If anything, the stars should appear brighter than they'd ever do on Earth. Their absence, theorists say, reveals the studio lighting used to fake the scene. Now circling back to Kubrick, the meticulous, paranoid genius behind 2001: A Space Odyssey, released just 1 year before Apollo 11. Well, it's claimed he was recruited by NASA to film the fake landing footage. In 2015, footage featuring a supposed interview with Kubrick confessing to the deed emerged, racking up millions of views.
Moon landings all were fake, and I was the person who filmed it.
You're serious? Okay.
I'm serious. I'm dead serious.
Okay.
The conspiracy theorists were right on this occasion.
And finally, the Apollo guidance computer, the machine that navigated 3 men to the moon and back, operated at 0.043 megahertz. Kaysing and his intellectual descendants argue that the computational and engineering capability simply did not exist in 1969 to execute such a mission. The technology, they say, came decades later. These are not trivial questions to wave away. They have been asked by millions of people across 5 decades. Well, they deserve answers, so let's give it to them. Before we examine each claim, it's worth understanding the scale of what we're evaluating. At its peak, the Apollo program employed 400,000 people. It involved 20,000 industrial firms and universities across the United States. It ran for over a decade. A conspiracy of that scale, maintained perfectly with not a single leak in 55 years, well, that would be itself the most remarkable human achievement in history. With that in mind, let's go through the claims one by one. Let's start with the flag. Now, the flag was not designed to hang limp. NASA engineers specifically installed a horizontal rod across the top of the flag to keep it extended and visible. A flag that just drooped over would be more invisible in still photographed. When Aldrin handled the pole, his movements through the rigid lunar soil created a torque, which caused the flag to oscillate. Because there is no air resistance on the moon, this oscillation continued longer than it would on Earth. It did not dampen quickly. Watch the footage carefully. The flag only moves when an astronaut is directly touching or near the pole. Between these moments, it is perfectly, absolutely still, as you would expect in a vacuum. On Earth, a studio flag would be constant, subtle motion from air currents. The Apollo flags are not. The Van Allen belts would have delivered a lethal radiation dose. This is the most technically substantive of the 5 arguments, and it deserves respect. The Van Allen belts are genuinely dangerous. However, the conspiracy version of the argument relies on a misunderstanding of both the belt's geography and the Apollo mission's trajectory. Apollo missions did not travel through the densest part of the belt. Mission planners deliberately chose a trajectory that minimized time within the high radiation zones. The astronauts passed through the outer edges of the inner belt and portions of the outer belt. Total transit times through most of the dangerous regions was approximately 30 minutes per direction. Radiation dosimetry badges carried by the 11 Apollo crew recorded doses of 0.18 rads, roughly equivalent to a few chest x-rays. The threshold for acute radiation sickness begins around 100 rads. Subsequent missions to higher latitudes received marginally higher doses, but all remained well within the survivable limits. No stars are visible in photographs, suggesting studio lighting. This one has a beautifully simple explanation, one that any amateur photographer understands immediately. The photographs were taken in daylight. On the lunar surface, in full sunlight, the correct camera exposure to capture the brightly lit landscape and astronaut suits, both reflecting strong sunlight, is a very fast shutter speed with a small aperture. Under those settings, the dim pinpoints of stars are simply not bright enough to register on film. They are drowned out by the exposure. This is not unique to the Moon. Photograph Earth's daylight sky from the International Space Station with the correct exposure for the surface below, and you will not see stars either. Photograph Earth at night with a long exposure, and you will see thousands. There are no stars because the camera was correctly exposed for the scene. To capture stars, you would need a completely different exposure setting, one that would have overexposed the astronauts and the landscape into blown out white.
Moon landings all were fake, and I was the person who filmed it.
Stanley Kubrick filmed the fake footage and left coded confessions. With this one, let's be direct. There is no credible evidence that Kubrick was involved in any NASA deception. The most widely circulated confession featured in a 2015 documentary by filmmaker T. Patrick Murray. The only issue was this was fabricated. The subject was not Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick died in 1999. The documentary used an actor. Murray later confirmed in interviews that the film was a work of fiction and satire. However, because it was formatted as a documentary and spread through social media without the context, millions of people accepted it as real testimony. The Apollo 11 jumper worn by Danny in The Shining is a real detail, but Kubrick was known for layering symbolic imagery through his work. The interpretation of it as a confession requires an extraordinary chain of assumptions and no actual supporting evidence. The 1969 technology was insufficient to achieve a moon landing. Now, this argument fundamentally misunderstands what the Apollo missions actually required from their computers and confuses processing power with engineering precision. The Apollo guidance computer did not need to run modern software. It performed a narrow, specific set of navigation and guidance calculations. The computer's job was not complex by modern standards. It was complex relative to what had existed 5 years earlier. Furthermore, the missions used a combination of onboard computation and ground-based tracking. The 70-meter dish antennae at Goldstone, Honeysuckle Creek, and Parks were essential parts of the system. The Apollo program was not a computer program. It was an engineering program. And its engineering, the Saturn V rocket, the lunar module, the spacesuits, was extraordinary but physically demonstrable. Saturn V remains to this day the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. Its F1 engines have been studied and partially reverse engineered by modern NASA engineers, who found them extraordinarily sophisticated. They exist. They're in museums. You can even see the burn marks. Then there's the Soviet Union. In 1969, the United States and Soviet Union were engaged in the most intense technological and ideological rivalry in human history. The space race was not merely a scientific competition, it was a proxy war for global credibility and nuclear deterrent posture. The Soviets had their own deep space tracking network. They monitored every Apollo mission in real time. They tracked the signals. They had every motivation in the world to expose a hoax, and they didn't. The Soviet Union officially acknowledged the Apollo 11 moon landing. Soviet state media covered it. Soviet scientists corresponded with their American counterparts about the returned lunar samples. No defector, no document, no deathbed confession from any Soviet official has ever suggested they believed the moon landing was faked. The moon landing conspiracy theory is psychologically fascinating. It emerged from a real place, a distrust of government, a disbelief that a nation that was simultaneously bombing children in Vietnam could be trusted with a narrative of heroism and human triumph. Those feelings were not irrational. They were not without foundation. But feelings are not evidence, and the evidence, all of it, independently verified across 55 years by scientists in dozens of countries, including those who were adversaries of the United States, well, it all points in one direction. And that was that Apollo 11 landed on the moon on the 20th of July, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on that lunar surface for 2 hours and 31 minutes. They planted a flag, conducted experiments, collected rocks, and then they came home. Hello there, truth seekers. If you've made it this far, then you are definitely one of us. We hope that you've enjoyed this video today. Please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. It helps more than you could ever know. And let's really build a community here. Please let me know if you think that we actually did land on the moon. If there's any part of the theory that we missed that we can cover in a future video, or if you have any ideas for any future videos, please also let me know. Thank you for your time and your energy, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.